right, welcome to the 6.3 notes. And so we're going to take a few different video sessions to talk about this section, which is events and listeners, because it's such an important section and it does take some time to get used to it. There's a lot of things to keep track of, and you might find yourself confused and frustrated, and that's okay. Just take the time, look over the code, and as you start to just familiarize yourself with it, you will get it. But basically the idea is that we've learned in section 1 about JFrame, about JPanel, adding content, things like buttons, and we'll do more of that. Then we learned about how to add content like rectangles that kind of appeared all over the screen, but we haven't really been able to connect those things. So in other words, what if I wanted to click a button and have it do something? Like, how do I actually, this doesn't do anything right now. All it is just sitting there, right? What if I wanted to click a button and have it add a rectangle, right? All we know right now is how to have it repaint by resizing this window. We don't have it so that when I click on this button or do, like, click on the mouse, that it actually does something. So we want to create listener classes that will respond to things like a button click. Another example, and this is actually what we're going to do, is we're going to use our same program from last time and have it respond. So notice how this time when I resize the panel, it's not just drawing randomly, because that's not really how most programs work. Actually, we're going to have it so when I click, it's going to draw a rectangle. So it responds, and if I hold down a different button, it'll do a different color, so on and so forth. So this is our first objective, is to use, create a listener class that will respond to generated events and that will create rectangles. And notice if I resize it, if I resize the panel, it doesn't delete them, they just remain. I can add other ones. So that's our first goal for today. All right, so our main, again, our GUIs are not like our old programs where we just have a main method and it just kind of runs through these subroutines from top to bottom and then finishes. This is event-driven programming, so the program should be prepared to respond to any type of events in any order, right? I don't know whether you're going to click the pause button or the play button, or you're going to ask for a red rectangle or green rectangle. You have to be able to respond in any, to any order. Okay, so basically you're going to have this loop running. Java, Java's going to control this, but it's going to wait for the next event to occur and then call the subroutine to handle the event. So it could be a mouse click and then a mouse drag, and mouse click. You need to be able to write those handlers. Okay, so we're going to focus on one listener class in particular first here, just to get an example, and then we'll talk about others later in this section and then in subsequent sections. But the first one we're talking about is called a mouse listener. Okay, and the methods required to respond to mouse events are in an interface named mouse listener. Remember, an interface is a contract. So by signing up and saying, yes, I'm going to be a mouse listener, you are guaranteeing that you are going to implement the following 5 methods. Mouse clicked, that would be pressed and released without moving it. Entered a component, so it kind of hovers over something. Exited. Pressed is when you just click and hold, and then release is when you release. We're not going to do too much with entered and exited in class. We're going to be focusing on clicked, pressed and held down, and then released. Okay. Now, just a few things here. This you're going to just see over and over again. This is the main kind of construct you're going to see. Whenever you create a listener class, and then you're going to create some kind of listener object, and then this part gets a little bit confusing, so we'll see it over and over again. What you have to do is, just because you've created a listener does not mean that the panel that you're clicking on knows about it. Okay? You actually have to do something called registering that listener with the component. And the syntax is component dot add listener. In this case, it's a mouse listener. Other times it could be like keyboard listener or focus listener, but this time it's a mouse listener, and then you write this guy. Okay, so component dot add whatever listener, and then listener object. And I put that in the shortened notes here for 6.3. I'll just kind of skip past these guys because we'll talk about an example there. But here's the syntax. Again, component dot add whatever listener it is, listener. And you can do this in different spots in your program. I'll try to give some different examples here, but if you're doing your program and you find yourself it's not working like you expected, this is one of the main things people tend to forget early on, is you just forgot to register it. You wrote the listener, but you forgot to register. So make sure you've done that. Okay, so to summarize, there's some things you want to remember. Make sure you import java.auth.event.star, so that will give you things like the different mouse events. Eclipse will do it for you, but if you're not using Eclipse, then make sure you do that. Make sure that your class implements the interface like mouse listener. So don't just write the methods, you have to say it implements mouse listener. Then you want to just say what do you want it to do when you click or when you press the mouse. And then finally, don't forget this one, you want to register that the object, register the object with the component. And again, that syntax is component.addListener, add mouse listener, add whatever listener, listener. Okay, so let me just pause here and let me just talk about, and this is a little bit confusing, but I'm doing this because also the textbook likes to do it one way, whereas I think it's actually better to do it another way. And so you're going to see different examples of these happening here. Oops. And so I'd say there's 3 different ways that we're going to see to implement listeners. And so the first one is the way the book likes to do it is that often the panel itself is the listener. So you're going to see this with any examples you read in the book. The J panel itself, so the thing that generates the clicks, is going to implement the listener. So it itself is going to like listen for itself. Like you're going to click on this panel, like click, and you're going to listen in on it on yourself. It's kind of weird, but basically the component is also listening on itself. Okay. And so when that happens, let me just jump back to the notes briefly. So you see this here. So a J panel can also be a listener on itself. And so you're going to see this weird syntax, this.addMouseListener this. And remember, this can be cut. So sometimes you might just see addMouseListener this, and that might be confusing. So I like to actually put the this.addMouseListener this. What is this saying? Remember, this is the component, right? This is the component, right? It's saying, I'm a J panel, I'm generating mouse events. I can tell when people are clicking on me, I'm just going to fire those off. But this is the second this is the listener, right? And this is kind of this weird case where because the J panel is a listener itself, you're listening for events on itself. And that's kind of a weird idea, and we're going to try to avoid that later on, but the book likes to use this. Other things. The book also likes to, I don't know what's wrong with this thingy. The book also sometimes likes to have the panel have a nested listener class. So it's going to have a separate class, but it's going to nest it inside. And so that keeps things a little bit more separated, but because it's nested, it has access to all of the variables here, so it kind of mixes things a little bit. So this is definitely easier than the third one that we're going to do, because you can access all the private variables in here without any problems, and it's still separated, so it's kind of like a midway point here. So this is okay, you'll see this in some of our examples, and you might want to do this sometimes. So a nested listener class. That has the advantage of you can access these methods and variables even if they're private, but you're still kind of linked together, right? This one you're totally linked. I guess I should draw another black box here, right? You yourself, I'll use the black ink for the listener. You are the listener. So the problem with this is if you ever decide to change this listener logic, because it's so linked with the J panel, you have to go in and kind of modify the source code a lot, and that'd be really messy. This one's a little bit less linked, because it's separated, but it's still kind of in there. So if you ever want to change the listener stuff, you have to go in and modify these things, and it'd be a little bit messy. And finally, the third one, the one that we're going to do, is the J panel and the listener are going to be separate. Now, why would we want to do this? This creates a little bit of extra work, right? Because now this guy doesn't have access to these private methods or private instance variables. You have to open up some different like getters and setters so I can actually get whatever I need. And then I have to register it. It's a little bit more interesting. How do I register this listener with this if they're separate? We'll talk about that. But the point is that if I ever wanted to do another listener class, if I wanted to make a new listener, I could swap it out. I could say, I don't want you anymore. I want to do this one. Or if I want a new J panel, like if I like this listener logic, but I don't like this J panel, I can make a new J panel down here and say, okay, you listen over here. The point is, when we'll explore this later in the year, is that if I separate things out, keep them loosely coupled, right? Loose coupling is an important concept, and we want to do that as much as possible so that in the future, if we decide to swap things out, it's much easier here than it would be here, and especially here. But we'll see all three examples, especially because we're just learning. But I just want to give you the reasons for why we're doing this. If it seems like it's more work, but it's actually better designed to keep things separate. So this basically just goes over the methods again. We'll do an example. These notes just kind of go into further detail about how to register a listener. Again, it's the component first, and then the listener object. We'll do some examples of that. I just wanted to point out again, this is just further explaining why we want to keep things separate, as I just showed. The relationship, we want to keep it loose. We want to keep that loosely coupled. That way, the listener doesn't know too much about the panel doesn't know too much about the listener. You can even develop them independently with no knowledge of how the other one works, and just use, the panel generates the events, the listener handles them, but really they don't have to know too much about each other, and this is good because you can swap them out easier. This table just goes to describe where we can register the listener. Sometimes you can register the listener in the main method, like if you have the JPanel and a listener object here, for example, you can register outside in main. Sometimes you can register it inside a class, like inside a constructor. That's also fine as well. You can register it inside the constructor of the component, or you can register it oftentimes in the constructor of the listener class, right? So sometimes you can register it in the panel class or the component, whatever it happens to be, or the listener. We're going to do this example most often, but just be aware you can register a listener in different places. Okay, we haven't actually talked about how we're going to work with the events that are generated. So as I said, there's 5 methods we're going to use for a mouse listener. Here they are again: pressed, released, clicked, entered, and exited. Notice how they all take a mouse event object. You can call it whatever, E or EVT or whatever. But the key ones we're going to do is we can actually there's some data held inside this EVT or E or whatever you call it object. And one of the key ones is what the X coordinate is and the Y coordinate of where you happen to click on that screen. Other things you can detect are some booleans, such as is the shift down, is control down, is alt down, is meta down, which would also be the command key on the Macintosh. There's other ones as well, like get button. You can check those out in Eclipse. And yeah, so I think that's good for now. Let's go to our work from yesterday, the drawing panel class that we did in class. And what I want to do is, I think it's probably a good idea to save different copies of these. So I have different, projects. So I have one for each different section, 6.1, 6.2, 6.3. So maybe it'd be a good idea to do like file, new project. Another way you could do it is just make a new package. You could do new package, and you could have like inside the chapter 6 project, you have 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, but somehow just create a new project or package so that we can save the old drawing panel, and in this way just create a new drawing panels and update that without having to mess with the old one. So let's say you have this old 6.2 package, you can just highlight both of these, do a copy, and then do a paste inside this, wherever 6.3 into the source or inside a package or wherever. Basically, just create a new copy. Right, you can pause the video if you need time to do that. And so here, where's the drawing panel class that we finished with? And so the first thing is we had this rectangle class nested, but turns out we're probably going to be wanting to do some more with this. So I want to, first thing, just as a matter of setting up for future work, because rectangles a class that we're going to be doing more and more, let's go ahead and just separate this out and actually make it a public class that's separate, not nested. So I'm just going to highlight that, cut it, and then create a new class called rectangle. So file, let's go ahead and create a new class called rectangle. Just going to paste that in, and it's going to make that a public class, not a private class. And we can still keep the same things here. Let's make the constructor public, though, so we can create objects here. And draw as well should be public, so that anybody can call draw as long as they pass in the graphics G. Now, a couple things here that are kind of cool for Eclipse people. Now that these are properly encapsulated, right? These are private, as they should be. We don't want people just being able to edit these willy-nilly. We have to do some getters and setters, right? We want people to access them, but through our defined channels. So before I start doing these, you could type it up by hand, and if you don't have Eclipse, you might have to, but you could type up, public void set x, so on and so forth. But Eclipse knows that oftentimes you want to generate getters and setters for all these things. So in Eclipse, we can just go to source, generate getters and setters, and we can pick which ones we want, and let's just do them all. And it's smart about doing the right type and everything like that. Make them public, and I'll just say click OK, and it'll generate them. So now I've got get x, set x, get y, set y, get width, set width, get height, set height, and get color, set color. And so that saved me a lot of typing. Okay, so now we've got those getters and setters. We have a rectangle class. Let's go back and check out drawing panel so we can see that. All right, so we've taken out that nested class. We still have number of rectangles that's necessary. We have a rectangle array. Remember, that stores the states that we can redraw them. I forgot to actually demonstrate how you run out of space. You can check that out. You'll see you'll get an error message there if you do more than 20. So for this purpose here, we can delete, let's just delete this draw string method. That was just to demonstrate when it was being called. I mean, you can leave it in if you want, but we'll keep the border here. Now, what I want to do then is, again, we don't want to be generating random rectangles with every call to repaint. What we want to do instead is we still want to go through and redraw all the rectangles that were stored, but we don't want them to be random rectangles. So I'm just going to I'll just delete it because you have another copy saved, right? So we don't need this x and y. We're not generating the x and y randomly anymore, right? What we want to do is we want the x and y to be the ones that where you clicked on it. Like, that's where I want to create a rectangle. Okay, so I'm not generating random x and y, and I'm not saving that with a random color in there. Okay, so I'm just going to, you can either comment this out or I'm just going to delete the whole thing. Okay, so basically all we have is a pink border, and then we're going through and we're drawing all the rectangles. They used to be randomly generated, but now we want them to be set when I click on a certain part of the screen. So you can delete this get random color too. We're not going to need that. Okay, so now we have it kind of set up, but we don't have any way to actually we don't have a way to connect it, right? We have to actually implement this listener thing. And so as I said, we're going to do it as a listener separate from the JPanel. I'll illustrate the different ways to do that, the three types again, as I said later, but we're going to do the, kind of, as I would say, probably the best stylistic one, which would be to keep things separated. So let's go ahead and create a new class, and let's go ahead and call it Drawing Panel Listener. Okay, so see if you remember what were the things we have to do to actually make this a listener. Not naming it, right? Just naming it is not going to do anything. But if you go back to the notes, let's take a look. So some of the things we need to do: we need to import the java.auth.event. So we could do that. I think Eclipse will probably do it for us if we forget. But we'll do that by hand. Second, we need to say that, hey, this implements the appropriate listener interface, whether it's keyboard listener, focus listener. In our case, it's mouse listener. So saying, hey, I'm defining this mouse listener class. Now, it's going to error right now because remember, an interface, this is an interface, it's a contract. And I'm not obeying the contract right now. I'm not implementing the methods. The great thing about Eclipse is if you just hover it over here, you can just click Add Unimplemented Methods, and boom, it'll add it for you. Remember there, mouse clicked, mouse pressed, mouse released, mouse entered, and mouse exited. Mouse event, and then you can call EVT or E, whatever you want, is the parameter. Okay, so we've done that. Let's take a look here. I want to provide definitions in that class, and then step 4, register. So let's do step 3. Let's figure out how we want this thing to work. Remember, the goal is we want it to do something like wherever I click it, let's say this is 0, 0, let's say I click on 50, 50. I want it to create a new rectangle at x 50, y 50. Let's say this is like, I don't know, x equals 200 and y equals 50, and I held the shift down. So now I want a green rectangle at 200, 50. Okay? So let's think about which one of these methods would that be? Well, it's not going to be entered or exited. We're not going to use these too much. It's not released. Remember, the difference is pressed is if you push it down. Clicked would be is if you clicked and then released without moving it. Okay. Well, I guess you could really do either one. You can kind of whatever you think would be the better one for this in this case. I'm going to have it where you just have to press it. Okay. Now, there's a few things stylistically. When you press the mouse, remember, do not do any drawing with graphics G. No drawing in here, right? So don't do stuff like no work, so don't do any work with graphics G. The textbook author explains this, that you can actually do some weird methods like get graphics, and he even does this. He violates the stylistic principles he outlined, which I agree with. So do not get graphics and work with graphics G in here. Only work with graphics inside Paint component. Okay, and that is to prevent certain things like kind of a flickering effect and things like that with threads that we won't get into. But suffice to say, don't do any work with graphics. Stylistically, let's keep all the graphic stuff inside Paint component right here. Okay, everything with graphics G, you should not have graphics G anywhere else except inside Paint component. Remember, this is going to be what is going to draw. Now remember, it's going to draw based on the state of our instance variables. Remember, we store the state, and then this guy just goes through it and just draws all the rectangles based on that state. Okay, now here's the thing. Remember, the state of our panel yesterday was set randomly. Right? It was just kind of like whenever you moved it and it called this guy, it generated new random x and y. It saved it in this guy, and then would go through and just draw them all. We want it to be a little more interesting, so we don't do any drawing. All the drawing is inside there. All we want to do is we want to set, right? We just want to set the state of the instance variables to include a new rectangle, right? We want to set the state. So here is where I'm going to put a new rectangle, right? So I would do something like, okay, let's see, what was it called? Like rectangles, and right, I'm going to put stuff in that rectangles array, right? So rectangles, you know, I don't remember what it's called, like number of rectangles. Except you can start to see, as I'm typing this, you can probably start to see the problem with this, right? This is a private variable. I should not be accessing this, and therefore I cannot do it like this. So this is part of the not the issues, but this is part of the things we're going to have to deal with when we are doing this design where we have, as I mentioned, a listener separate from the panel, right? So this guy does not have direct access to the rectangles array, right? But that's what's keeping track of the state. So what I need to do is I need to provide some kind of interface, such as getters and setters. Like I could have something called add rectangles. Add rectangles, and it's an interface for this guy to come in and say, oh, okay, you clicked, I know all that information about where it was, stuff like that. I need a way to get in to tell you that there was a rectangle. So let's go ahead and let's so before I can do any work in here, I have to open up that interface inside the drawing panel, right? Right now all I have is actually, I did not encapsulate this properly. Excuse me. We should make this private so that no one else can access it. And then stylistically, we should open up an interface so that we can access that rectangle, right? So the listener is going to know when the rectangle was added, and it's going to go in and alter this state so that when this guy goes and draws it, it'll draw that new rectangle. So going to drawing panel, we can do something like, okay, public void add rectangle. Okay, and so, and what are the things it would need to know? It would need to know what the X and Y were of where it was clicked. Let's see, what else? A width and height, and let's say color, like we talked about. Oops, color. Okay, and so now I could just say, okay, rectangles, just like we did before, at that spot, num of rectangles equals, and I'll just pass this in, and then I can increment num of rectangles. Oops, plus. Okay, so basically we're allowing, a way for this guy to be called publicly. And again, you could, if you want to do it in one step, you could just go like this, because that will do it in the original one and then increment it afterwards. Oops. So now we've provided that. Let's go ahead and use this add rectangle. Okay, so we're in the listener class, and we're saying, okay, when the mouse is pressed, like right here, like at 50, 100, right? This mouse event object E contains that information. Okay, so I want to use that information and create a new rectangle, right? I want to set the state of the instance variables to include a new rectangle. I'm not doing any drawing, so let's see what that looks like. So I would just do something like, all right, I want to do something like add rectangle. But I see more problems here. How do I call add rectangle? Add rectangle is not part of this class. Add rectangle is part of the drawing panel class. Okay, so this is part of an implementation detail. Remember, we made the choice to have the listener be separate from the panel. And this is, again, we're seeing a little bit more issues here. I don't have access to a reference to this, right? Here, it would be a little bit easier. Here it would be even easier. But in this case, we have to do a little bit more work again. So, this guy, how do I call this? Okay, so one solution is to, inside our listener class, as an instance variable, I want to save a reference to the event generating component. Right? In this case, the J panel, or the drawing panel. Right? And the save it a reference to the event generating component. So drawing panel, let's just call it panel. Okay, so that means I'm just saying this is a template, remember? I'm saying every listener is going to have some kind of reference to the guy that it's listening for, right? That I am listening on or for. Okay, and what we can do then is we can put in our constructor, we can define a constructor. It says public drawing panel listener. So every time I create a drawing panel listener, I could say, you know what, I'm going to force you to pass in a reference to a drawing panel. And so I could say this.panel equals panel. So we're defining set. You have to pass in a reference to a panel every time you create a listener. That way, this is how we can be hooked up. And now that I have this reference, whenever I create a drawing panel listener object, I got this reference now. So this is great because now I've got this panel object reference. So whenever mouse pressed is called, right, it's fired off here, I can say panel dot add rectangle. Okay. Now, just to keep things simple, what is the x and y? Remember, what is the x and y that we should be adding? It's not random. It is the x and y that we clicked at. If you remember, it is based off of this mouse event E. This object contains that information. So I go here, I could say E dot get x, and that will be the x coordinate, e.getY. Width and height, I could do like random, I could do other things, but just to keep it simple, let's just do like 100 width, 50 height, and then color. You could do all red, but again, we want to make it a little bit more interesting. And remember, this guy contains stuff about like whether shift is down, stuff like that. So let's make it a little bit more interesting, and let's have a color C, and let's have C be set by whether shift was down or so on and so forth. So let's have a little if statement. If E dot is meta down, let's set color to be C dot color dot blue. Else if E dot is shift down, and you can do whatever color you want here, C equals color dot green, green. And then else, you got to do some kind of catch-all here, because otherwise it wouldn't be set for sure. C equals color dot red. And now I've added this rectangle. So let's go ahead and remember, this is great. We've done it perfectly. We've set the state of the instance variable. So we reached into the panel. We have a reference to the panel. And we reached in through the public interface that we created here, because this is private, this data structure. That's what we want, because remember, the paint component is going to just draw based off of that state. It's going to go through and draw those rectangles, and now they will be added to that array based on clicks, not on random stuff. So this is all good. If I try to run this guy, so if I go to my drawing panel main and I run it, notice how if I resize, it is calling paint component, but it's not randomly generating them anymore. That's good. And I click and nothing happens. And this is going to happen to you probably at some point in this chapter or later if in the year. And so a good debugging tip is to go to your listeners and just do some system outs. Okay, system.out, mouse pressed. This should be happening. Now if I run it, and I click, I guess I'll just show where's my console? Well, my console is not visible to you, but it is not showing up. There we go, I got the console. Let me try it again. Yes, not showing up. All right, so we have forgotten one of the main things that happens a lot. So see if you remember, what have I forgotten to do? What have I forgotten to do? Done step 3. I provide a definition of what's supposed to happen. Step 4. I forgot to register it. These, again, are two separate things. The listener and the JPanel are two separate things. How do I know who is supposed to listen on what, right? These are separate. So let's go and take a look here. So I need to register here in the listener class. The way we're going to do it is in the listener class, we are going to register. So if we think about it, remember the syntax is always component dot add whatever listener it is, and then the listener. That's the syntax. So the component is who's the generator? It's the panel. Panel dot add, and then what type of listener? It's a mouse listener. And who is the listener? Well, we're in the listener class, so that would be this. Okay, so the way we're doing is we're putting the listener inside, the registration inside the listener class. You could put it inside the component class. You could put it inside main, separate from both of them. But this is how we're going to do it for now. All right, now if I run it, it's still not going to work, because if I go back to main, do you see another problem? I've created the JPanel, the drawing panel, but remember, when is this happening? This is happening in the constructor of the listener object. This is only happening when I construct a listener object, which I haven't done. So in the main, once I've done this, underneath that, let's go ahead and create a drawing panel listener object. Drawing panel listener equals new drawing panel listener. And remember, we have defined the constructor not to be blank. It must take in a drawing panel, right? That's how we save the reference. We're setting it up that way. So we pass in a panel. Okay? Oh, sorry, not panel, content. It's called here, content. So now this is hooked up. And actually, since the main purpose is just to create this drawing panel listener class, we don't even need a reference to this listener. You can just go like this and just say new drawing panel listener. And this way, there's a listener object, the registration happens, and it has a reference to this guy, so now everything is all good. So now if I go and I click, oop, there it is, mouse pressed, mouse pressed. So it's hooked up, it's working, but it's still not drawing a rectangle. So there's still one more thing going on here. So let me go back to the listener class, and I can see, all right, it's getting in here, and that's key. I'm adding a rectangle, and if I go here, for example, inside paint component, if I did some kind of like I could check a debugging. I could be like system.out print line number of rectangles. Let's see if it's actually updating that. Okay, so if I run it, let's see, 0, and then let me resize it so it'll call paint component again. Okay, oh, wait, so that's the key. If I click this and I resized it, oh, it adds all those ones. So what's happening is it's click, 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 click. Oh, so they were all there, it just wasn't being redrawn. So in other words, remember, I don't call paint component, the system calls this. But if we want to force the system to, hey, call this as soon as possible, we call repaint. So when do I want to do that? I want to call repaint as soon as I add it. I don't want to have to wait for someone to manually resize it. That's weird. So if I go to the listener class, as soon as I've altered the state to include one more rectangle in my array, I'm going to call repaints, right? And not repaint. We don't repaint the listener class. We repaint the component, which is, luckily I have a reference to that, panel.repaint. So I would say this is another main thing people forget to do is to repaint. Okay, so first thing people forget to do is to register the listener. Second thing people forget to do, call repaint. Now if I try to run it, if I go click, 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 there we go. I can try to hold down shift, there we go. I hold down the control key, there we go. So we have got our first working listener class hooked up, registered, repainting. Everything is working good so far. Last thing I want to do is to get you set up for your homework. And so that is going to require, your homework is, I want to ask you to draw not only rectangles but ovals. And so in order to do that, you're not going to be able to just have a rectangular array. I want to practice using the concepts from chapter 5. So let's go to File, and let's go ahead and create a new interface. So we're going to create a new interface. Excuse me, let's call it drawable. Drawable. Remember, interfaces often have that able. And so what we're doing, again, we're saying we're going to create a contract that to call yourself drawable, all you got to be able to do is be able to draw yourself. Okay? And I pass in the graphics G. And remember, interfaces do not have any implementations. You cannot put these here. You just put a semicolon. You are saying, I got to import graphics. Okay? You're saying everybody that's drawable needs to implement this draw. So who do we have that's drawable so far? Well, we've got our rectangle. Okay? We've got our rectangle. Rectangle has a draw method, but we didn't have the interface before because we didn't know we were going to add other things. So let's go ahead and say public class rectangle. That implements drawable. What does that do? Again, that says, all right, it signs the contract. Rectangle, of course, already implemented the contract, so we're good there. Why do we care? Why do we just needlessly complicate this? Because remember, the beautiful thing is, if I want to do other drawable things, say ovals, all I'd have to do is create a new class, let's call it oval, and let's say I say implements drawable. Oops. So I'm saying, okay, I want to be drawable too. I'm not following the contract yet, but I can add it. And now, as long as I define this method here, what we can do is we can create an array, not of rectangles, but of drawables, and that way I can traverse that array and print out rectangles and ovals this time, and we can make our program just a little bit more interesting. Okay, so make sure you add a drawable array, a drawable interface. Let's have an oval class that implements drawable. Implement what you need to do for oval, and change your data structure to not only hold rectangles, but rectangles and ovals. All right.